Hey guys, welcome back to another Architectural Real Talk. So today's topic is quite interesting. Someone asked me, why do I have a vendetta against production homes? Why do I hate houses so much, especially in the late 2000s, and all of these houses have become pretty much how fast they can be produced in 100 days, 90 days, and they're pretty much cookie cutter homes to begin with. But even then, the argument that I felt like that was the most plausible to argue against was, what would the houses look like if they weren't to look like this? Because they serve their function as providing a home for the family, then what would they look like if they were any different? And the phrase form versus function came to mind, or form follows function. This was a term that was coined by Louis Sullivan in 1896. In his article about the tall office building artistically considered, pretty much around the whole idea that as these buildings got taller, when it went from 10th floor to the 11th floor to the 12th floor, and so on and so forth, as these buildings got taller, they still maintained those same ornaments that we would see at a street level. For example, the gargoyles got raised higher and higher until they were no longer visible. And so for all the ornaments and all these iconic columns and things like that, as these buildings started getting taller, the attention to details when it comes to those ornaments disappeared, because why would they even be created if visually human beings couldn't interact with them? And he coined this term to say that we should be voiding all of these ornaments because the building is now more about function. And it created a striking divide between what's now we know as architecture. Is either you have a category that supersedes function over form, or you have a category of architects that form is pretty much the fundamental and function follows it. So let's look at these two groups head to head. The first group that we have is a function that yields to form. That pretty much that everything that we have around us needs to be centered around programmed spaces. They need to be meaningful, they need to be efficient. The function of the spaces are the priority in the design process, and everything centers around it. And this was embraced by the modernist movement. And you can see these works in Mies van der Rohe when he looked at the Crown Hall IT building. And you can see the likes of this when it's being done by Richard Myers. And he went as far as to say that there's no need to be use of colors. Why would you void a building of color? Because that's just merely a distraction. That architecture is merely an extension of lines and it serves the function of that house. So there's no need to have the color there, right? And the white was the height of modernity. You see all of these various type of architecture come about, and it's polished concrete floor or it's raw steel. And this was the purity that came out of functional architecture. You see simple tectonics, material for what it is. There was no sugarcoating it. There was no hiding behind a curve. That brick is meant to be celebrated as an arch, as Louis Kahn would say, and it was simply that. And then there was the other faction. And the other faction said that function is secondary to form. And this pretty much described architecture as a capital A, if that makes sense. Pretty much you had the Zeitgeist movement, you have the likes of Rem Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid, Frank Gehry, all of which fall under this movement of postmodernist era that pretty much revolted against classical ideas. They said that architecture is an object, is more prevalent, that this object needs to be celebrated, that architecture didn't know how important it was until it was struck by light. And all of these classical sense of ornaments trying to use the material as expressively as possible. The continuous curves, the way bridge is being built by Santiago Calatrava off of one column, cantilevering out another 50 feet and maximizing this expressive visual striking ability of architecture. And it drew a lot of attention. You can look at the works of Frank Gehry as he crumples the paper and says, this is architecture. And he throws it on the site and says, this is a building. Now, I am of the belief that there's no right or wrong answer. And the reason I say that you can't simply have an object that is occupied and call it architecture. Neither can you actually just have a building that is purely functional. Because the moment you start dropping walls and the moment you start creating paths and places for people to be, and start including privacy and this public notion, you have to have barriers, and that barrier is going to ultimately create a form. So you can't void one or the other in every aspect, right? And at the same time, this movement didn't particularly only affect architecture. It also influenced other parts of design. So for example, if you were to look at the Chrysler 1935, Chrysler came out with a car that was shaped of a teardrop, functioning around the aerodynamics that that car would provide. So if you were to look at that as a notion of, oh, this is beyond function, because it's no longer going from point A to B, but it's also thinking about fluid mechanics or fluid dynamics when it comes to how this can be more fuel efficient. But those type of movement gave rise to what I call the third faction, that neither form or function should take priority. And I know this is a contrary belief to what a lot of things are being taught, that function should be higher priority. No, a building will either be categorized more towards aesthetic or more towards function, but it can never stay in the middle. That is the caveat of having an architect building that is actually expressive. You are defined as architects by the very fact or notion that you innovate on prior designs, that you push the boundaries. We are more like classical architects today than postmodernists, because they used to say that it should be void of all function. It should be like a concrete slate and all white walls, because that's what the function is. We don't say that. We say it should be expressed, it should be controlled, it should be part of its context, it should reflect the concept, it should implore these design strategies, right? For example, if you have a building that is limited by site, there's no choice but for that program to go vertically up. And as it goes vertically up, it is up to you to control that decision at how the building would go up, how it would vertically be formed. And same thing goes if you have a notion of something that needs to be covered, whether it is for a bus stop, for a shaded region, is entirely up to you whether you stick a rectangular plank over it that sticks out of the building and covers that small spot, or the entire building cantilevers over and juts out and creates a gesture that shades that region. So there is a balance. If you were to look at the architect Fay Jones, where he designed the Thorncrown Chapel, and this is a very, very aesthetically striking building, open to nature, and at the same time, it relates back to how functional this building is. The relationship between the aesthetics and the beauty of this building and the function it serves as a way to connect to God, which in itself in Christianity is the relationship between light itself. And the way this building celebrates that is an direct example of what I mean when you merge form and function together. Another example would be any building that is done by big architects. If you were to look at the simplistic notion by which these programmatic elements are used as a way to create the form itself, it is a direct solution of architecture, but at the same time, a way to create a striking visual that makes an impact in the architectural community. You have the work of UNstudio, that box to blob concept, and they explore the depth of what a concept can be and pushes the very boundary of material, fabric, texture, and the tectonics of building all together. The visual way they put together materials have a striking impact in how the building is formed in the first place. And at the same time, it serves a function beautifully. You can look at the Mercedes-Benz Museum, for example, another beautiful, striking building, but at the same time, it has a very strong function and a very reason why it needs to look the way it does, because every car is moving on that track. Prominent architects today implore this idea because this justifiable notion needs to be expressed to the client. You cannot tell me simply that I have never done form ever. Because once you stand in front of a jury and you start justifying why you make that specific decision to make that curve and not angular, that has to be a form decision. That was an aesthetic decision that you made. But if it's backed by fundamental value of it serves this purpose, this is what the architects intended, it actually have a reason to exist. As long as you can provide function to the form that you created, or the form is illustrated or is actually being directly tied or derived from the function of the building, then it holds precedent and the building itself now has values. And that's what I meant when I said a 1960s or a 1970s building is stronger when it comes to its relationship between form and function when it comes to the houses today, because we're just making them airtight and put them up as quickly as possible. With that said, continue liking, subscribing. Follow for more content.